Le Mans 66, also known as Ford vs Ferrari in the US, directed by James Mangold, starring Christian Bale and Matt Damon. It details the rivalry between the two companies, Ford and Ferrari, that happened in the 1960s and centered around the 24 hours of Le Mans, considered at the time to be the most important and prestigious race in the world. So at the beginning of the decade, Ferrari was dominating the race with their superior cars, but in investing so much into the racing division, they nearly went bust. Ford then offered to buy them up, and they almost closed the deal until Enzo Ferrari learned that he would also be giving up full control over his racing division, which was sort of his wonder child. So he broke off the negotiations, he sold to Fiat instead, and insulted most of the senior executive board of Ford in the process. When Henry Ford II learned of this, he was pissed off and decided to set up his own racing division at Ford, build his own racing car, and win Le Mans. In order to do so, he hired Carroll Shelby, played by Damon, a former legendary driver who himself has won Le Mans in the past and was now building cars for a living. And Shelby in turn got Ken Miles, played by Bale, a driver that was equally brilliant and difficult to work with. Together, they set off to create the Ford GT40, and the movie details several years of their fight against Ferrari's superior cars, against their own internal problems with the cars, with their own machines, and their clashes with the executives of Ford who continued to meddle in the process. Now, first things first, the movie is fairly accurate in terms of the historic events. That's always a concern in movies based on true stories, that they will change and omit and embellish things. But here, the actual story was fortunately interesting and compelling enough that it didn't require any large changes. The most notable one is perhaps omitting the 1965 race from the narrative. But I'd say that's a fairly solid choice because that particular year didn't really bring much new in terms of how the story went between 64 and 66. And by just skipping through it, the pacing of the film is tighter. Then there was a second concern that the narrative would be presented as David versus Goliath, with Ford in the role of David. Whereas actually, yes, Ferrari was far superior in terms of sheer craftsmanship, especially at the beginning of the decade, but Ford had incomparably more resources. And by just throwing money at the problem, they would eventually catch up. There's no two ways about it. And I'm happy to say that the movie does show all of that. It's true to that aspect. In fact, more than a rivalry between Ford and Ferrari, it showcases the internal struggles in Ford, the clashes between Shelby's team and the executives. And that brings me to the description of the movie as a whole now. So it gave me strong vibes of Rush, the 2013 film about Formula One. However, there is one key difference. So that film was balancing two aspects of the story primarily: the historical events of the F1 circuit and the races, obviously, and the personal rivalry between Niki Lauda and James Hunt. Here we also have the historical aspect coupled with the races, the story of how GT40 was developed and used in those races, Daytona and Sebring and Le Mans. We also have the personal aspect, the difficult friendship between Miles and Shelby, and also an inside look into Miles's personal life with his family. But there is also that third aspect, the business side of things. We get to see how the Ford executive board were constantly trying to have their own way and undermine everything that Shelby's team was working for. It's made very, very clear that the suits are the villains here. And that's done very well, because I was infuriated at some of the events presented and had this sort of justice boner whenever Shelby and Miles would get to prove that they were right. In general, the film just worked for me on an emotional level, mainly because of the performances, I'd say. Damon is solid as usual, but there are three other people that impressed me more. The first one is obviously Christian Bale. He's just consistently fantastic in everything he's in, and Le Mans is no different. He disappears into the role of Miles, and I have to say he's different than what I expected based on the trailers. I thought this was going to be another one of his intense and serious performances, but instead he's very playful, he's very fun and outgoing with the role. Even if he's an asshole a lot of the times, I thought he was easily the most entertaining part of the film. You also have to highlight his physical transformation, yet another one. Just last year in Vice, he played Dick Cheney and he gained a lot of weight for the role, which was pretty unhealthy. And then in just a couple of months, he lost all of that and then some. I've read that Matt Damon actually approached him and he was impressed and kind of concerned at the same time and asked Bale, how did he do it? And Bale just responded, well, I didn't eat. Uh, the second performance that impressed me was John Berntal as Lee Iacocca, the Ford executive that first comes up with the idea of having a racing division, of doing the races, and he reaches out to Shelby. His role is definitely secondary, and he doesn't have a lot of screen time, but damn does he use it to the max. There's just something about him, the little gestures, facial expressions, reactions to what's going on around him, that makes him stand out from the crowd. And that's also a thing of his. It's not the first movie that he manages to take a small part that could otherwise very easily be forgettable and do something cool with it. And finally, we have Tracy Letts, who plays Henry Ford II. His part is also relatively small but crucial. He's great at creating this persona of an arrogant, entitled, but powerful businessman that is easy to anger and difficult to please. He can be really terrifying when he wants to, and I think without this gravity that he brings to the role, the story just wouldn't be the same. In technical terms, I think that the film deserves to be seen in the best conditions you can get. A large screen, a good audio surround system, because it looks and sounds just majestic. Mangold knows how to find an amazing shot, and he definitely does that here multiple times. The best part are obviously the racing scenes, in particular the final race in 66, because some of the shots in there are just gorgeous. And in terms of sound, the mixing is incredible. All of the cars sound properly loud and angry, and I also noted how well the soundtrack worked within the film. Take all of that together, and you end up with a really engaging, really gripping, but also just pretty entertaining film. It made me nervous, it made me excited, it made me angry, and especially towards the end, it made me sad in a bittersweet way, and definitely emotional. It's just a really solid piece of cinema that works on every level.